So good morning. Hopefully you're in the right place, adding accessibility into unit tests and improving audit results and our experiences. So before we get too deep into it, I just kind of want to outline what we're going to be talking about. First of all, introductions. What is accessibility? The laws, the guidelines, some of the reasons why we have to do this, basically. Other testing methodologies, and then we're going to go into actually automated unit testing. So first of all, who are we? I am Elizabeth Simister. I am the Product Accessibility Manager with Blackboard, and I am in charge of making sure that people can use our products with assistive technologies. This is Heidi Jungel, and she is our accessibility engineer. She is the developer responsible for actually making sure that the code is accessible. So what exactly is accessible? What does it mean to be accessible? As defined by the Cambridge Dictionary, it is the quality or characteristics of something that makes it possible to approach, enter, or use. So why do we want to talk about that, right? It's not only the idea of the legal obligation that we have, right? It's the moral obligation that we have in thinking about this. If you have an application and you're trying to use it and you are blind, how do you get into that application? In thinking about accessibility in terms of digital content, that's really, really critical in this modern era, since so much stuff is done online. I've added a couple of other relevant definitions up here. Digital content, so things like text, video, audio, graphics, animations, typically things that you can download on a Kindle. And then information communications technology. And that's examples of things like your hardware, your computers, your kiosks, your multifunction office machines, software applications, mobile applications, websites, and things like PDFs. So now the good stuff, right? The laws. There are two laws in the European Union that are very important around digital content. The first of these is EN 301-549, and it basically means that anything that you buy has to be accessible. That's the basics of that law. And then we have the EU directive. This applies to public institutions, and it basically requires that anything that is digital content be accessible. This is kind of very new. It was actually being enforced as of September of this year. In the United States, there are three laws. The first two are up here. Americans with Disabilities Act, Titles II, Titles III. And Title II is really the one that applies to public institutions and digital spaces. Titles II and Title III both require that the physical parts of a building be accessible. We also have Section 508. Section 508 is similar to EN 301-549 in that it is what do you buy, right? And if you are a public institution, you have to buy things that are accessible. The last part in the United States law is the 21st Century Communications Video and Accessibility Act, or CVAA. And that's much more around things like your television, your mobile phone, audio, and video. So that's where we need to think about those sorts of things when we're talking about websites. I have 4 other countries up here who also have very strong accessibility laws, especially around digital content. That's Canada, the Accessible Canada Act. That also just came into play in 2019. Australia has been around from 1992. Originally, it did not include digital content, but since it was enacted, they have now decided that, yes, this does in fact apply to things like websites. And then India and Japan, they both require that digital content be accessible in the federal space. The last part of this is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? And these are the foundations of everything in the world in terms of the laws. There are 3 levels, A, AA, AAA. Most countries do not go to AAA. The law is typically up to level A or AA, and you have to be level A compliant in order to be level AA compliant. Most of Europe follows the current standard, which is WCAG 2.1. The United States follows WCAG 2.0 AA under Section 508. So that's the boring part all done. Now comes the fun part. How are we actually testing for this? And there's basically three ways that we go around this. Automated testing. And automated testing, as we know, is kind of a yes-no process, right? If I have an image with an alt attribute, that is a pass. If it does not, that is a fail. Then we have our manual testing, and that's where you actually have to have a human sit down and make subjective decisions. So color contrast, that has to be 3:1 for things like images and 4.5:1 for text. And that's because someone with low vision or color blindness, and actually people with certain types of cognitive impairments, that's how they're going to be able to see the content on your page. High contrast, same kind of idea as color contrast. For people with low vision or color blindness, they need to be able to use their operating system in order to see content on a page. Magnification, that is definitely specific to people with low vision, and that usually is about 200%. Can I enlarge the screen, and can I still get to all the content? And that's something that a lot of people don't think about, especially in a responsive setting, that you zoom up, and all of a sudden you can't slide with your scroll bar to get to content. One of the most important things to me when I'm looking at an application from a manual testing standpoint is your keyboard navigation. Keyboard navigation is critical to people who are blind, who have motor impairments, and sometimes people who just prefer to use the keyboard, or they're using alternative devices like speech-to-text or joysticks or eye tracking. If I cannot get to interactive content or interactive elements on a page with my keyboard, that means that you are going to basically exclude a large portion of the disabled population trying to use your website. Code review. I put advanced on here because most of the people in this room probably can do code review, but not everybody can. And when it comes down to it, WCAG is basically all about the code. Are you meeting specifications? And the last thing that I have on here is assistive technologies. And I put this as an advanced. And the reason that I put this as an advanced is because if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to come up with a lot of false positives. So my recommendation is typically have somebody who is a power user test your applications, because they're going to know certain shortcuts. They may have their device set up in a certain way that works best for them, and they're going to be able to give you the feedback on how accessible your application really is. So some pros and cons in the world of automated accessibility testing. First of all, it's fast. It catches about 25% of all possible issues. There's a lot of free tools out there. The cons. There are false positives. It only catches 25% of all issues that are actually out there. Each tool is different. And that's one of the hardest things as in my role, is that I have clients that come to me with different test results from different sites. You need to make sure that you're setting your conformance, because if you don't do that, you're going to get false positives. A lot of these tools use something called best practices. So they're not necessarily using the WCAG language itself. They're kind of translating it for you. And then there's inconsistency in how the results are displayed, right? Automated testing, in my opinion, is a great place to start because it will give you an idea when you go to do that code review of where you need to look. So it's great to do that. In terms of being fast, most of these results come back in a very, up to a minute at the most, depending on how you're using it. And then you also have the tools that will spider for you. So they'll go out, you can stick in one URL, and every baby URL from there, it'll tell you the accessibility of that. They use the math, right? That true-false idea. Great. So I have an image. It has an alt tab or an alt text, right? It doesn't tell me, and this is where the manual review comes in, it doesn't tell me if that alt attribute, that value, is actually appropriate for the image. I usually use the example of, I have a picture of a lion, but my alt attribute says cat. All lions are in fact cats, but not all cats are lion. That alt attribute is not going to make sense for somebody. It's not going to give them enough value. So again, several tools, which is great because it gives you a lot of diversity and an option to find the one that works best for you. But the language that they sometimes use, those best practices, they can become outdated very quickly. So you really need to make sure that you're paying attention to what results are coming out. And then if you, like I said, you gotta double check your standards. What are you testing against? Because if you're testing against AAA and you're not working with a AAA organization, you're gonna get a lot of false positives. At this point, I am gonna turn it over to Heidi to explain the automated unit testing.
So we heard Elizabeth mention automated testing covers about 25% of accessibility issues. That can be great. However, not all developers use an automated tool or run the same one. And we found that developers who do run that test don't always know how to fix the issues found. And some developers who have accessibility knowledge were often taught incorrectly, like focusing on one assistive technology rather than the code itself. And sure, we can do training, but that's not going to be sufficient. While it can be great, training is only as good as the developers who stay with the organization. So what I mean by that is, according to the Department of Labor, as of 2018, the average employee in the United States stays with a company a little over 4 years. It takes quite a while to really grasp coding for accessibility. It's almost like learning a new language. So by the time the employee becomes proficient, they could be moving on to another organization. And therefore, training would have to be constant. And that can be both time-consuming and costly. So because of those issues, we were finding that when we have an external vendor conduct accessibility audit, they were catching these major yet easily fixable issues, like alternative text for images. Therefore, we looked into implementing accessibility checking into our unit test. Adding this functionality ensures that we're being proactive. We're not waiting for the accessibility audit to give us those results. It prevents those issues from ever making it into production. Putting this into unit tests will allow developers to focus on the code rather than that overwhelming knowledge of accessible coding practices. And that can be a daunting task in of itself. Likewise, the way we can structure our accessibility unit test does not rely on the developer knowledge, but it focuses on how they can fix those issues found. So what we did is we searched and we found an external tool to use called Axe, which is from a major accessibility company, DQ, which many of you may have heard of. Axe is an open source accessibility rules library that allows us to add accessibility to our test environment. So I'm not here to promote Axe or DQ. It's just something that we found worked best for our needs. Axe had the best support for multiple environments. It allows us to place these into our React and Angular frameworks using Jest and Jasmine. And the Axe core portion, which is what we're using, is free. So what we did, we're starting out small but mighty by implementing this into our common components library, which is used across multiple applications within our system. Then we plan to bring this into our Ultra framework. So how does this work? I'm actually going to slide the computer over a little bit, and I am actually going to open up a tool. This is our code that's holding an application that is strictly just our Axe core. So that allows us to use this application and kind of import it into other products. So I have this file open called generate AX report. And what that is that's allowing me to set the rules and the standard. I'm not going to go into too much of the details of the AX rules and their standards. They have an extensive documentation on GitHub. So at the end of this presentation, I'm actually going to give you the link to the GitHub for the AX core. So back to this. I've got this AX standard to run. So what it's doing is it's mapping against that WCAG 2, 2AA, 2.1AA, section 508. That 2.1AA is what Elizabeth was talking about, kind of checking for that European standard. It's making sure that when we run the accessibility checking, that we're checking it against global markets as well. Then I have this AX rules to run. Now these are the rules that we have changed the default. They have many other rules in here. And you'll notice that a lot of them are set to false. And you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, these are all accessibility issues. And yes, they are. But the nature of a unit test is it's going to break the build. So we had to decide, are these critical to halt production? Are these critical issues that are going to prevent all developers from releasing that to production? And not all of these are. That doesn't mean we'll ignore them. It just means these are more bug ticket worthy issues rather than production halting. So for example, I've got this duplicate ID. And what that's doing is it's checking for almost what it says. It's checking for the same ID on multiple controls. But as a developer, if I'm having that, I'm likely going to have problems with my code long before I run into the running a test. So that's not something we really felt was worthy to add in there. Similarly, we have this HTML has lang. And what that's doing is it's checking for the language attribute on the HTML. However, that's set at a global level. So as a developer myself, I would not be able to control that. And if there were a problem with that lang attribute, all developers are going to have problems. It's not going to load the text on the page properly. There may be some missing components. So it's really not something that should be preventing a developer from releasing their code. But we also have a couple of rules that we have enabled. So we have this tab index. And what that rule is checking for a value of 0 or -1, nothing else. So I can't have 1, 2, or 3. The challenge with this is they actually had this map to a best practice. So you saw I had those standards, that section 508, the WCAG standard. Well, best practice was in there, and it's kind of a nice to have. However, tab index kind of is a WCAG rule for meaningful sequence. That is because we were finding what was happening is developers were adding 1, 2, and 3 values to sort of structure it from what they think is accessibility without changing the order within the DOM. And the problem with that is it causes problems with multiple assistive technologies, screen readers, external keyboard-only users, speech recognition software. That's a pretty extensive accessibility issue. So therefore, we added that in there. I'm going to scroll up a little bit. We have this label title only. And what that's doing is it's checking for the title attribute of an input control and nothing else. And if that's found to be true, then it's going to flag it. And that's what we want. Because as somebody who's using speech recognition software may never know what that title is. That title is often when somebody hovers over an input field and you'll see something pop up. If I'm not using a mouse, I may never know what that label is. Also, I talked about that common components library. We actually have an accessible input field in that common components library. So we're sort of forcing the developer to use the common components library rather than creating their own. So I'm going to do things a little bit backward. I'm actually going to run a test. So I'm going to run a test that's going to map it against that project. So I'm going to run npm conf test conf.test.js. And so what it's doing is checking that generate AX report, it's checking its standards, it's checking the rules, and it's wrapping it sort of in a nice little package. So it looks like I've got a failure. So I am going to scroll up, and I'm going to see my error. Conference test page must be accessible. And they have AX violation. If you hear me say AX, that's just our internal term for accessibility. Then the violation found has a pretty critical impact. And it says images must have alternative text. And for this description, ensure image elements have alternative text or role of presentation or none. Then I have a help URL. And that help URL actually takes the developer to DQ site, and it provides the guidance. It allows them to get information on how to fix the problem, some examples, some code examples of how to fix the problem, and even some writing tips for the specific issue. And they can also get some information on the impact, why it matters, the assistive technologies that are impacted by the violation you just created. Then we also have, if they really want to get into it, they can get some detailed information on the disability groups impacted. I can get the details on that WCAG statement that's really the problem. The idea behind this was, instead of having a developer sit in a classroom for an entire couple of weeks or so and forget it the minute they leave the classroom, we've all been there, we wanted to sort of guide them as they go along. So that way, as they're doing this, they're kind of learning without wasting time in a classroom, but also as they go. I'm going to go back here. And then, so we've got the help URL. Then I have the exact element that is impacted. And this is the DOM output. So if you're in your browser and you do an inspect, this is the actual DOM output. So I have this image class of cute dog. Then I have some solutions. It basically says fix any of the following. And what it is the AX program checklist sort of thing. It said, element does not have alt attribute. Nope, it didn't. Does it have an ARIA label? Nope. ARIA labeled by? Nope. So it's sort of, if none of those were found, then you're going to spit out that violation. To give you an idea, the first solution listed is usually the preferred one, that alt attribute. The idea is we know as developers that's not always the plausible way. They may not have the right permission. They may not have the right access. And like in any code, there's more than one solution to a problem. So that's why there's several listed here. We actually have two violations listed. There's the second violation of the input class of search field. The way we have written this is each accessibility issue is listed as a separate violation. So if there are 17 accessibility issues, there are going to be 17 violations listed. If there are 2 images that lack alternative text, there's going to be listed here twice. And the idea behind this was to allow developers to easily go and, okay, look at violation 1, I'm going to solve violation 1, that's done, move on to violation 2, and so forth. I have to give a shout out to my colleague David on this. He structured this in such a way that is really legible. I can easily identify those violations and sort of check them off as I've completed. I'm going to take a look at the actual test that we ran. I'm going to open up my project here. And I've got my conference test page. Here's that conf-test.js page that I just ran. And you heard me talk about that generate AX. So here's where I'm importing that generate AX report. I'm importing that from a separate project, allowing me to use it through multiple applications. And there's my test, the conference test page, and the individual test must be accessible. Then I have the particular component that I want to render, that conference component. And here I have is the actual, pretty much the lines that I have, just a couple of lines to run that report, lay it out, and spit it out on my terminal. Something to keep in mind. If the content is not in the DOM at the time the test is run, it's not going to check it. So for example, if I have a button control that opens up a dialog, It is never going to check that dialog unless I have accounted for some type of simulation, whether the keyboard click or keyboard or a mouse click. So you always want to make sure you do that. I have done that in one of two ways. I've either put it in the same test, this must be accessible, or I've created a separate one. More often than not, I create a separate one. And that is because of the amount of content that I have, or it just really depends on your organization and how you've structured your test. But we still have some violations to resolve. So I'm going to go to the actual page, that component that we talked about. And I'm going to scroll, and there's that familiar image class of cute dog. So remember that first solution said it couldn't find an alt attribute? So I'm going to go ahead and add alt equals cute dog. But we had two violations found. So the second one was that input class of search fields. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and I see there's that image class of input class of search field and placeholder of search. Just a little backstory, placeholder is not a valid label for an input control. Elizabeth and I can have a whole presentation in of itself on that, but the purpose of this is to actually get this test running. And that first solution said it was missing an ARIA label. So I'm going to do ARIA label equals search. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to put garbage text in here. And the reason I'm doing that is you're going to see the test still passes. That is because the nature of that test was looking for the attribute, not the value. So that goes to back where she was talking about having some sort of code review. You'll always want to make sure that you're doing some sort of code review on this, checking to make sure that those values make sense and that the alt attribute actually is sufficient. In most cases, this wouldn't be this obvious. It would likely be a misspelling, but that's something to keep in mind. So I'm going to save this, and I am going to run this again. So it's checking the updated code against that generate AX report. It's checking against the standards and those rules that we've set, and it passes. Something to keep in mind, you probably noticed it moved a little bit slow. That was one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is it's using Jest and React, and for a small test, that should be instant. And it sort of makes sense that it would move a little bit slower because for accessibility, it has to check through the DOM. It has to check all the components, sort of how they relate to it. However, for a small test, it is almost doubling the time. And it leads into kind of the second challenge that we had. I myself do not have a strong unit test coding background, and we found a lot of work was needed to get this set up. And that meant I had to rely on other team members and taking time out of their projects and stuff. It was just taking a lot longer. There is probably some information in that extensive documentation to improve the React or Jest. So moving forward, we definitely want to make sure we're getting more familiar with the documentation to see if we can resolve the build time issues we have with that Jest and React. And that means getting more comfortable with the unit testing as well as the backbones of the act structure. We also want to add some more customized testing. So for example, this free version that I showed you does not account for keyboard interaction. I believe the attest version, which is their paid version, I believe it does, but I want to be able to do that myself. I want to be able to account for things like up and down arrow keys on a menu. I also want to be able to do some unique testing for our needs. An example is we were finding a lot of developers were adding an anchor element with a row of buttons. However, in 99% of the case, they forget the keyboard interaction that goes with button, the space bar. The problem with that is it's preventing users of assistive technology, screen readers, speech recognition software, external keyboard only users. They are not allowed and able to interact with that button. And instead of adding all that messy code, most of it is because they want to style that button. So we want to be able to create a test that sort of forces them to use a button control and use CSS. So once the issues are resolved and we have some of the customizations in place, then we want to be able to move this into the rest of our applications within Blackboard. I threw a lot at you guys at once in a short amount of time. So I wanted to kind of just summarize what I just did. So I had that generate AX report. I mapped it against the standards, the WCAG, the section 508. I had those rules that we went ahead and we disabled a lot of them. That doesn't mean we'll ignore them. This just means that they're more bug ticket worthy issues rather than production halting issues. And we had a couple of the rules that we actually enabled, that tab index, that label title only. And we ran a sample test. We ran that conf test page with some errors. And we took a look at the description, the URL. We got that DQ's URL for information on how to resolve the issue, the element that was impacted by that violation. We took a look at the sample test that we had. We took a look at, how it was really structured and found it's not a lot of code. And then we took a look and resolved that test and ran it, or resolved the code and ran that test again. There were some noteworthy thoughts I kind of wanted to remind you. If the content is not in the DOM at the time the test is run, it's not going to check it. So you always want to account for some sort of keyboard interaction with that test. And it does not always check the value, but the attributes. You always want to do some sort of code review in that. So to conclude, automated testing only catches about a quarter of accessibility issues, and it requires developers to consciously run those tests. We want to be proactive rather than reactive, and that includes adding accessibility into our unit test. Using X for our test allows developers to easily identify and fix those accessibility violations. And sure, we've got some improvements to make and goals to achieve with this tool. The objective is to create an application that has minimal accessibility issues, if any at all. So sort of a disclaimer that I hinted at earlier, Blackboard is not endorsing any of the tools discussed in this presentation. There are just several tools that are generally available. And we recommend that your organization uses the tool that you feel most comfortable with. So as promised, we have several of the links. So first two links are the GitHub for or one of them is the GitHub for DQ. That is where it contains all of that extensive documentation that I was talking about. The second one's sort of a marketing site, but it gives you the exact tool that we were using is X for web. They have some for mobile and some other ones, but our specific example that we saw was one for the web. And they have the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I talked about that 4 years, so that's where my citation is for that. Then we have a couple of URLs for the WCAG and the digital accessibility laws that Elizabeth talked about. And then if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact Elizabeth and I. So I have that contact information and that as well. So thank you guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.